Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. So this week I thought I'd show you how I created this rather weird impressionist landscape painting with some sheep in it. It's got kind of an eerie sense of light. So I just wanted to share with you the whole story really from beginning to end. So I started out last January in a field on the outskirts of Exeter, and I was quite captured by the weird light you can see in the sky there, the way the light's catching the trees. And apart from these sheep being rather unhelpful, you can see they've had a little bit of a chat. They saw me at the gate and they thought, we don't want to be painted. We don't want this guy to sketch us. And they proactively rearranged themselves so that 90% of them have their butts facing to me. Completely not what you want when you want to sketch sheep, but what can you do? What can you do? So anyway, having taken a little bit of footage there, I got the sketch pad out and started working away with a biro. And I really enjoy sketching with biro, actually. It's a little bit of an underused medium, I think. You don't see it much, really, even though obviously biros are used all the time for writing. But the ballpoint pen, you can get a lot of marks, a lot of different expressive marks and different types of shading going. And so it's really good fun to use. It's especially good fun if you combine it with things like alcohol-based marker pens, because then the ink from the biro will bleed a little bit and give you lots of nice, interesting effects. Anyway, so I took a few still photos as well, as you can see there, and continued with my sketching. And really I was just trying to capture different poses of these sheep and, just work quite quickly, not being too fussy at all. And it was just nice. I mean, this was filmed back in January, but it was quite a nice day. It was a little bit chilly, but quite calm. You can see there is a little bit of a breeze, but really very pleasant being out in the fresh air and just resting the pad on the metal gate there and sketching away. And one of the great things about doing this, of course, is you get to capture sheep lying down, twisting, cleaning themselves, whatever they're doing. And the same whenever you sketch any animal from life. The disadvantage is the animal is typically constantly moving, but the big advantage is you get to see the animal in its entirety in terms of the full pattern of its behaviour. So when I do these quick sketches, some of them turn out rather better than others, inevitably, but I find them all rewarding, and I always learn something from each of them as well. So having done some of these sketches and spent a bit of time looking at the flock, I thought, well, this scene could be, make for a nice landscape painting. And so, when I've finished with the sketches, what I'll do is I'll head back home and work up a painting, and the painting is actually going to be a mixed media painting, but we'll get to that in a little bit. You can see on screen what I'm doing there is just adding some cast shadow and lots of different textures to this sheep which is lying down. You can just about see her appearing at the top of the screen when I look up. It's actually the second closest sheep to me. Now, because of the fisheye lens, it looks very, very far away, but in actuality the animal is pretty much close enough that you can still get quite a lot of detail. So that's the sketching done. Chuck the sketch pad back in the car, and now I'm back on my mixed media paper. I was using mixed media paper out in the field, but that was just A4 in size. This is A1 in size, so that's 8 times as big. And you can see I'm using a burnt umber watercolor marker pen to just very quickly line in the tree line at the far edge of that field, and the hills up on the left, and some of the other trees which were present there. And then having done that, I used the same watercolour marker pen to start to draw in some sheep and some other sort of perspective lines. And so, I really like painting animals, but I'm becoming more and more in favour of doing animals in landscapes. It's something I've done for a long time, but I do alternate between that and just doing the animal on its own. But I'm really enjoying working outside more and more of late. So animals in landscapes, and at the moment you can see I've got 5 sheep in the picture. And now I've switched to the inktense pencils. And so I've just fired in a quick burst of magenta across the sky, and then grabbing my giant paintbrush and spraying that with clean water. This is what's so cool about the inktense, is that once you dilute them, then you get a wash of vibrant colour, and then once that's dry, it's completely waterproof, so that's really cool. Having put that in on the sky, you can now see I'm giving a similar treatment with some blue, but this time I'm extending that blue into the distant hills. And although they're not that far away, there was kind of a bluey tinge to the colour. Once again, get the brush nice and wet and get that inktense wash going and moving and overlapping the magenta. And by scumbling the brush, we get lots of nice texture. And you can see I've put kind of an orangey brown into the distant hedgerows. And this time with some vertical up and down brush strokes, allowing the brush tips of the bristles to kind of give me a soft edge along the top of those hedges. And now I'm adding some green to the field. So you can see I've let the bluey wash come into the distant field deliberately, but now I'm going in with a warmer green. And once again, with a wet brush, I'm going to blast across that with my with the huge brush, and I'm going to let my brush strokes run without a care in the world right across those burnt umber sheep, because the watercolour will also dilute and run into the green. So it gives us a nice little bit of variation in tone and colour, and you get these lovely brush strokes because the inktense is so so thin and so fluid. So you get a nice bit of texture in there as well. And very, very quickly, so in just a couple of minutes, a big A1 sheet of paper, we've been able to get some drawing and colour down across the entire painting. So having got that colour down, I'm now coming in with my interactive acrylics and a 1/2 inch flat brush, and I'm going back over my drawing. So I put down the loose drawing with the watercolour marker pen, and as we saw a moment ago, I've moved that around a little bit, just a little bit, by putting the wash of inktense over. So that initial drawing is now acting as a guide to me as I go back over the drawing with some burnt umber paint. So in certain areas I'll be able to just follow the lines, but as you can see I've actually corrected the head of this first sheep, and I'm also using that same brush with the same colour to put a bit of tone in as well. And so I'm really just sketching just in the same way that I was doing when I was out in the field. Just because I'm back home, I'm still sketching in the same way. It's just that this time I'm using a brush. So those preliminary lines that I put down, sometimes I'll follow those exactly as I just said. Other times I will make modifications, but because they're there as my initial framework, I'm able to proceed in quite a relaxed manner, really, because they act as a guide. I'm not going to stray too far from them in general. And so, I can be expressive and relaxed and just kind of work away quite gently and have some fun, basically. So given the tonal treatment to the second sheep now, and I'm just indicating a little bit of a cast shadow on the field there. And then having done those first two sheep, I realised that the third sheep needs a bit more attention and a bit of a change of shape. So I basically correct that and block that in more or less silhouette, really. Just fill it in with the burnt umber. You can see I've just moved the tail much further to the right and I'm making the animal a bit bigger, so that those three sheep are huddled together rather more than they would have been if I'd left this third animal at its current size. So basically I've kind of reduced the gap between the three sheep. And then I thought to myself, well, perhaps I'll put another sheep off in the distance there. You can see I've also modified the foreground sheep on the right. And then I changed my mind, and so that's a good example. The interactive acrylics, because you can spray them with water, you can see I've almost completely removed that dodgy sheep off in the background, and once I go over the field again, you won't be able to see what marks are left. So what I'm doing now is I'm working again on the foreground sheep and bringing that sheep much more into prominence, really. So bringing it much closer to the viewer, as if it's kind of wandered into frame from the edge and is peering out at us, and adding some dark shadows. And that's a technique, putting an animal really big and close up in the foreground corner. I've used a couple of times over the years, not that often, but I have done it before, with cows and sheep. And so that's my thinking here. Now I'm keeping the shapes quite simple. I'm just putting in some nice dark colour, some nice dark blue with a little bit of burnt umber in, and then a white, just really to make sure I completely cover what was there before. But while I've got that white, it's not pure white, it's titanium white with a little bit of ultramarine blue in, and I'm just adding that to the three sheep on the left that I worked on previously to increase the sense of light that we've got in the painting. So we want these sheep to look as if they're being illuminated, by the low winter sun. That's the idea. And the third sheep that I put in just silhouette, you can see that I'm now going over most of that with a lighter colour. So the idea of the silhouette was really just to block out the preliminary drawing, the bit that I'd made a mistake on. And then next I'm coming in with some pure blue, and what I'm doing now is adding some cast shadows from the animals, but also in just a second I'll add in some cast shadows from the trees, because the scene had these lovely long shadows cast across the field from trees which were just to my left as I was sketching. So the trees themselves are completely out of frame, they won't feature in the painting. But once I've finished adding the shadows underneath the sheep, I will add those in. We'll come to that in just a second, but this blue I'm using, my intention in the end is not to keep the shadows pure blue, but I will probably overlay other colours. But I quite like the pop that the blue gives by putting that down as our initial shadow colour. But what I'm doing right this second is putting in those long tree shadows. So we can imagine the trees are off to the left of the painting. They're quite tall. The sun's reasonably low in the sky because, as I say, I was doing this back in January, even though we're in the middle of summer now. And those long shadows, I feel, really help lead the eye off into the painting and add an interesting framework across the, what could otherwise be a fairly blank field. Anyway, the sky is now completely dry, and I've got that underlying coat of inktense there. So now I'm coming in with some clouds using my interactive acrylic. So I've got my nice big 1-inch flat brush. I've mixed up a bluey grey, so some burnt umber, ultramarine, titanium white, and I've probably added a little touch of a red in there as well to give me some purpley grey clouds. And you can see I'm just loosely taking the brush across the sky there. And this is a technique you may have seen me use before with another sheep painting from a few weeks ago. So it's, I really love it actually. The inktense has a luminosity underneath, which comes through underneath the acrylic when you leave it exposed in certain areas. So not a technique I've used that much yet, but I certainly plan on continuing to use the combination of inktense and the interactive acrylics. It seems to work really well. Next I need to add some trees to the hill on the left. So using a slightly smaller brush and a darker bluey green browny colour. It's kind of, let me rephrase that, it's a brown with a hint of blue and a hint of green, that's what I'm trying to say. And you can see I'm just quite loosely and softly putting in some trees here, adding trunks by turning the brush onto its edge, letting the brush roll across the paper, making little circular marks, light, almost dry brush strokes to vary things as we move across the hillside, and then coming in with some rather bolder marks for the next block of trees, which are a bit closer to us and lower down on the hill. So by keeping things loose and keeping our arm relaxed and our hand relaxed and not overthinking things too much, you can see we can kind of scumble in these masses of tree life. But if we vary the brush strokes and vary the quality of the stroke we use, then we can get a whole range of textures and tones. And now I'm coming in with a lighter colour to pick out some of the highlights. But you can see I'm treating the trees here as a mass. I'm not drawing the individual trees. So I'm just kind of blocking it in and treating it very much as textured patches of light and dark. But again, the inktense is still showing through on the field. So now I'm adding a little bit more of a warmer highlight. Now I've mixed in a bit more of a yellowy green. And again, the paint is still fairly wet. And if it gets too dry, remember this is the interactive acrylic I'm using, so I can just spray the paint with water to soften things up a little bit and keep things fluid. And the paint's kind of running out of my brush, so I'm really scumbling now and pushing hard to get that dry brush texture over the top of the dried inktense. And hopefully you agree with me that that hillside has started to come to life now. There's a real sense of light playing across the hillside. But what I need to do is just put in a darker green along the bottom of that tree line. And what I'm also doing is making the, putting in some hedges as well and kind of covering that bottom edge of the tree marks that I put in. So the trees very much sit in behind the hedges and behind the edge of the field. So this green's been mixed up with a cobalt blue and a cadmium yellow, then a little touch of red just to take it away from being a pure vibrant green, just make it a little bit more of a tertiary colour than it would be if we just kept the blue and the yellow in there. And now I've added a little bit of titanium white and I'm just lightening certain areas there. So we get a little bit of variation, even in that simple patch of colour. We want to vary the tone that we've got. And then putting in another hedgerow in front of that. And what we're going to do is also obliterate that sheep off in the background, because I decided I didn't really need... The original idea was by having an animal much smaller off in the distance, it would help create a sense of depth in the composition, but I'm not sure it needs it. Although that said, I may just pop one in, towards the end of the painting. And continuing with those colours across the rest of the field, but you can see I've switched to more of a purpley colour. And I just sprayed the surface of the painting with water to get the paint really flowing smoothly and get those wonderful brush marks, occurring automatically, keeping things nice and loose, going over that kind of coppery colour that I used with the inktense on that hedgerow on the right. So you can see I'm using energetic, loose brush strokes, much in the same way as I did with the big brush, but moving a little bit faster now with the smaller brush, because I want that overlay of brush strokes from the inktense to kind of come through the very thin purpley overlayer that I've put on top. So the distant landscape and sky are starting to come together now, and I don't know how well you can see that on camera, but what I'm trying to show you is I've just gone back to my huge brush, and on the tips I've got a mix of an orange and a mix of a yellow in different patches on the brush, and by just tapping that, tapping the ends of the bristles over the dried background for the hedges, I can now create the light, the low winter sun catching those hedgerows and pick out lots of different highlights automatically by just tapping that huge brush over the dry paint. So again, I'm getting a contrast in brush strokes because I had the energetic back and forth, up and down, left and right, purple brush strokes underneath. And now I'm just tapping. So that's putting down a lot of little tiny marks, but in different directions. And even now, as the paint's starting to run out, I've switched now to kind of a scumble. So you can have fun, have a great deal of fun just experimenting and, varying the pressure, varying the direction, varying the angle of your brush. Really experiment if you're going to give this type of technique a go. That would be my recommendation. And just explore what kind of effects you can get. So we're starting to get some of the winter colours coming through now, some of the purples and the oranges and the coppers. But we've got some kind of spindly trees off on the edge of the distant edge of the field here. And so I'm doing those with a pale bluey green. And again, I'm keeping the treatment of those trees quite loose. But again, it's a different brush stroke. So you can see it's a little bit more considered. But by using the flat brush end on, I can still get a relatively precise line. But I'm careful not to make those lines too continuous, because a broken line suggests more of a sense of movement, and it tends to push things off into the distance a little bit as well. Because perhaps the light is catching a branch in one place, but it isn't catching the light so strongly a little bit further on the branch. And so that gives you kind of a broken area, a broken line of tone, basically. And so that's what I'm trying to simulate there. But again, in a loose impressionist way. I'm not trying to draw it in great detail. So next up, I'm putting in a lighter green, similar to the way I did with the dark green on the left. I'm putting a lighter green in. And so this painting, is coming along quite well, I feel, and I like the painting as a whole. But at this stage, I was starting to think, well, hang on, before I go any further, if I just look at the left-hand side of the painting, the three sheep, and the sense of light I've got on the hills, and the way those colours play against the pure blue shadows in the foreground, then I'm starting to think, actually, I quite like just that bit. So one of the great advantages of digital technology is, of course, that I can capture part of that and put it on my website as a print, and then that's preserved forever. And then what I can do now is do that, and then I can continue at a future date with the entire paintings. And so that's my plan. But let me just show you the finished image up on the website. Hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show, and thank you very much for watching.